Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The engine drama is reaching fever pitch going into the 2026 season as Audi, Honda and Ferrari reportedly putting a letter together to the FIA to protest what they think Mercedes are up to with these compression ratios going into the upcoming season. But Mercedes say that they spoke to the FIA a long time ago indicating their intention to do this, and effectively the FIA gave them their blessing at the time. What does that mean for next season? Are the FIA massively biased in favour of Mercedes getting back on top? Could they reverse their decision, banning Mercedes cars, which would probably mean that there are 4 teams turning up to Melbourne next year without the ability to race? Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This has blown up massively over the last few days. We're going to get into it. That's George Russell in that picture just then, who is maybe, after all of this drama, considered to be, I wouldn't say is the championship favourite. We see that technically people seem to think that Max is the title favourite for next season. Time will tell, but certainly if Mercedes have the best car, George will be the championship favourite. But of course, there's also McLaren in the conversation too. It's pretty funny here, little secret Santa. George Russell gets this gift from Charles Leclerc. That overtake that was pretty controversial at Zandvoort earlier in the year. Couple of quick updates to go through here before we talk about this engine stuff against a Cadillac. Actually some rumours on what their car's going to be like. Of course, not many expectations for the Cadillac team or Haas, especially because questions on Ferrari's power unit. It seems like with all this power unit drama, Ferrari are probably the most frustrated team right now because they sacrificed a lot going into 2026 to make this generation of rules work for them. But there's a feeling that it might just be dead in the water before it even starts because of this ICE stuff. So optimism for Ferrari, for Cadillac, for Haas, who of course Cadillac for now are going to be Ferrari powered, isn't especially high. But how good are they going to be, right? We've got the number 77 of Valtteri Bottas, the number 11 of Sergio Perez. According to rumours, it's not going to be a Haas, as in Haas will, as always, take everything that they can from Ferrari and do the best they can with it. They will be going for the double push rods that Ferrari are going for as well. Some questions on whether that will become standard or whether Ferrari have no idea what they're doing. But apparently, early images of the 2026 chassis, the Cadillac car will actually have, well, it seems to have pull rod attachments at the front. So they might be taking a different direction. So the point is they'll have the same engine, but Cadillac are building their own technical team that will try and move things in a more impressive than Haas, let's say, immediately longer term, medium term direction. What optimism we can have about Cadillac next year is relatively limited, but we'll see what they turn up with, of course, when we get to next season. George also talks a little bit about the potential rivalry. I think for some time I've wanted, even pretty much since 2022 Barcelona, when they had that good battle for a few laps when Verstappen's DRS wasn't working. Since that moment and since some of the drama following that season, a Russell Verstappen title fight has been a rather promising option. Now, it's not happened yet. Russell says Max is the gold standard. He's the one that I'd want to go head-to-head with. He's the only one that people would question. He's the only driver on the grid that you'd want to be teammates with to see your competitiveness with, which I thought was a pretty interesting statement. I guess Russell feels like he proved everything he had to against Hamilton, so now it's time to take on Max Verstappen. Look, they're not going to do it in the same team. Not yet, anyway. Guess time will tell on that. But potentially in another car, because if it's true that Red Bull powertrains are the other team that has been exploiting this potential loophole and advantage, then maybe Red Bull are going to be pretty on the pace, and maybe compared to Ferrari or something. And if they are, then of course you cannot count out Max Verstappen, and George Russell certainly won't be doing that. Again, some questions on McLaren, right? Because you would expect, or certainly a Formula 1 fan from the outside looking in might think, well, hang on a second, McLaren just won last championship. Why are they not the favourites for this one? Why is Lando not the favourite to go back-to-back, or Oscar, or whatever? That's not the way that the bookmakers see it, because brand new engines, the integration with the chassis seems to be more complicated, but still, McLaren should be in the conversation. The question for many is that dynamic at McLaren going to last forever? Are we going to see a Piastri-Norris partnership for too much longer? Some say no. There was a rumour that Mark Webber, and look, if Mark Webber's doing his job as a manager and an agent, he will be having conversations with other teams, but there is some talk about whether Piastri is at least looking at a couple of options on the market, because things are going to get crazy a few months into 2026, probably a few races in. If Ferrari are bottled it, if Red Bull are terrible, it depends what happens with Aston Martin, all these other questions, but the reality is that things will shift quite quickly a few races into 2026. Opportunities will be available. There was some talk a little while ago that Red Bull were actually particularly interested in Piastri in the event of Verstappen leaving. That's one option. There's also the potential Aston Martin consideration as well. And look, Norris is not going to go anywhere from McLaren anytime soon. I think we can be pretty damn sure of that. But Aston, they may need one or two drivers in the coming years. There has been a little bit of talk about Charles Leclerc. Of course, Max Verstappen can only drive one car at once, which limits the options of Mercedes, Aston, whoever else might be interested there. So that's the rumour on that. But let's talk about the engine stuff yet again. So I'll just bring this up on screen if you guys don't want me to go through the whole thing again as to what's been happening over the last few days. This is a reasonably concise summary. Effectively, next year's engines, the compression ratio in the cylinders has been moved down to 16:1 from 18:1. The rules say that you can't go over 16:1, but it's tested at ambient temperatures, which of course is, well, effectively room temperature. Call it 25 degrees. Certainly not where these engines operate at about 120 degrees. So there's a rumour that some manufacturers have found a way to pass that check when cold, but increase the effective ratio when it's hot and running due to various physical effects. That would be a massive engineering challenge, but apparently they might have found a way to do it. Now, again, this could be a red herring. This could be some level of distraction. There are rumours that, maybe Mercedes have found something else, but actually all the talk is about the compression ratio, so the focus is going here. Again, this is F1, this is loopholes, this is politics, this is kind of what it's all about, certainly in these off-season interim periods when new regulations are underway. We also know that there are a handful of guys at the FIA creating these regulations, trying to enforce them. The teams have lots of money and thousands of top engineers trying to break the rules effectively. So this is simply how it is going to be, especially as the engine regulations and the regulations full stop get ever more complicated. It's also worthy of note. There's a limit on power output, certainly from the hybrid units, the energy from the battery. But the internal combustion engine power is actually not. So it's all rather interesting in the sense that the whole point of these regulations is this great marketing spin, right? Oh, we're going 50-50, so it's one step closer to net zero, whatever they want to say. Now, because of that, there's loads of complications. We've got to use active aero, all sorts of other problems that are resulting really from this 50-50. But also it's kind of ironic that the hybrids, let's say, development, the MGUK, all that side of things, is not massively improving or innovating. The innovation is actually coming in the ICE, because that's where the power is unlimited and potential gains can be found. So if you were able to increase that compression, you would gain roughly 13 horsepower. That would give you maybe 0.3 a lap. That's a very big deal. That could mean it's over for the rivals to Mercedes and potentially for Red Bull powertrains as well. The one thing to say about Red Bull is that, as we discussed yesterday, Mercedes have been doing this for a long time. They've been working on this engine and this compression ratio system, if that is what they're doing. And again, when we talk about whether it should be banned or whether it's illegal or whether Mercedes are going to be restricted from even racing next season by the FIA if they change their mind or whatever, that we've got to recognise that Mercedes have been working on this for probably a year, if not longer at this point, this idea. Now, apparently 7 months ago, one of the Mercedes engineers went to Red Bull and told them what they were doing. But there was an article that suggested that Red Bull could actually reverse this, or not necessarily reverse it, but they would be able to race with a different engine because they've not baked this so fundamentally into the architecture of their engine. That's at least the rumour. Again, this is all theoretical. We don't know what Mercedes are doing, even if they're doing this. And even if we did know, and of course, based on discussions we're going to have in a second that they were having conversations with the FIA, they're definitely doing something. It might be this, it might not be. And even if they are, how do we test for it? And probably the main problem that Mercedes rivals are currently running into. But this article alleges that because Red Bull haven't been working on it for so long, if the FIA were to say, all right, we're going to ban it, anything over 16 to 1 is totally illegal, and unlucky Mercedes, Red Bull would be able to produce an engine which complies, whereas Mercedes might not be able to. They wouldn't be able to because they've baked it in for so long. It's all in their entire design, effectively, of the engine, is the rumour. Again, what's true, who really knows? What we do know is that the FIA apparently aren't going to ban it yet. Whatever happens, they might say, all right, we'll fix it in 2027. And as I say, this has caused a lot of controversy, and we're going to discuss some of the reaction in a second, certainly from the perspective of different teams on this one. But this was also mentioned in the race's article. In fact, I'll just read it from the article initially here. The way the fuel compression rules have evolved and make it explicit that checks are conducted at ambient temperatures, the FIA has doubled down on there being no ambiguity about its stance. As long as it is satisfied that the procedures to check the compression ratio at ambient temperatures are followed, that is as far as its involvement needs to be. Mercedes has been in dialogue with the FIA throughout the rules process, so there is no element of having tried to sneak something through. It has had reassurance that its interpretation of the rules is in line with the FIA's, so it has kept pursuing this design process. Now, would the FIA change their mind? It's a good question. Peter Winter did an interesting video where he talked about when Adrian Newey came to the FIA in 2009 and said, okay, we've got this idea about the double diffuser. They then told him, if you pursue that, you will be outlawed, it will be banned. And turned out Brawn did it anyway, and they got away with it, and they won the championship in large part as a result. So these things can happen. But it's very interesting if it's true that Mercedes aren't stupid, right? They've also got 3 customer teams to supply. They wouldn't pursue this type of idea if this is what they are pursuing. Again, I have a feeling that there might be something else going on here. Because to me, this compression ratio loophole feels so obvious. Does it not? I would be very, very surprised if the other teams didn't also have such a conversation. Because, look, there's thousands of engineers working on these things. They've taken the compression ratio from 18 to 1 down to 16 to 1. All the engineers know there is more performance at 18 to 1. The rules explicitly say they're tested at ambient temperatures. So it's a very obvious loophole to be like, well, could we try and get it more at a different temperature when it's not tested? It's like, this is what these guys do for a living, right? So, and they've done it in so many other regards. You're talking about flexi wings, you're talking about all sorts of aerodynamic components that are restricted in the way that they can run. But even there was rumors about the floor this year, like ways that you can use expanding materials on the floor to make sure you get less plank wear than you should, and all this stuff. Like, this is what these guys do. So the idea that it was only Mercedes that spoke to the FIA to say, we've got this idea about these compression ratios, can we maybe do more if it still aligns? And if the FIA have told them yes, then it would be shocking if no other team has asked that question, to be honest. So I'm intrigued to your thoughts in the comments, but just feels strange that Mercedes have worked on this for a year and nobody else even knew until the last week or so. Seems surprising when this is not like an unknowable loophole based on the way that the rules are written. In fact, it very much lends itself to being considered in that way. So I feel like there might be more to this than we're currently seeing, but I don't know, we'll see. The FIA clarified. They said the regulations clearly define the maximum compression ratio as well as the method for measuring it based on static conditions at ambient temperature. So look, when quizzed, the FIA have basically said, this is what the race guys were talking about in terms of doubling down. It seems effectively that they're saying, look, this is how it is. We're not going to change our stance. So this is the way that the regulations are currently written, C5.4.3. No cylinder of the engine may have a geometric compression ratio higher than 16 to 1, which is how they describe 16.0. Here, they talk about a couple of other things, but effectively that is the way that it is. However, there is also this other line, as we know, C1.5, which says cars must comply with the regulations in their entirety at all times during a competition. So this is kind of the big point of debate, is you've got one part of the rules that says this is how it's tested, this is how it's measured. You've got another part that says they must comply at all times. But Look, we know that this regulation, C1.5, is getting broken all the time. The last couple of years, this has been the big drama about the flexi wings, right? Most of the teams had wings on their car which were deforming, we think, more during the Grand Prix than they were allowed to. But because they were tested statically and we couldn't test them in real time, I don't know that to be true, but I can be pretty damn sure it's true because the FIA tried to shut it down. So, you know what, did we declare all those cars illegal? They were probably running in a state which did not comply with Article C 1.5, but yet it was, it's considered to be a loophole. So again, that's the debate when it comes to 2026 and these engines, because look, as I said, I would be surprised if these other manufacturers didn't at least have a conversation with the FIA about this loophole, because it appears that Ferrari, Honda and Audi thought, all right, 16-0 is the absolute cap, there's nothing else we can do. But again, if Mercedes have been talking to the FIA for a year about saying, we've got this idea, what do you guys think? And the FIA have been like, well, if it complies, it complies. I'm a little bit surprised that it's now taking Ferrari, Honda and Audi the time to write a letter complaining about these engines and these activities. But, understandably, they would be frustrated if this is actually what is going on. The question then becomes, like, what should or could the FIA do about this? Because look, if it's true that Mercedes engines are running with more than 16-1 compression ratio during the race, then it's an illegal engine in some capacity, right? And as a result, Ferrari, Audi, Honda, fan accounts, Aston Martin fan accounts are going to say, well, it should be banned, right? The integrity of the sport is at stake. The FIA must not allow this. But again, it's like, well, what are they doing? Do we know? No. Maybe somebody does, because Mercedes will, but how do we test for it? So how can you prove that Mercedes engines aren't compliant? Okay, if they spoke with the FIA and they've embedded something into their car, but even then, right, how do we know exactly what they're doing or whether it's even successful? We don't. And due to thermal deformations, even an engine which is not being used with the same whatever trickery Mercedes have come up with, we think, on this issue, they might also be pushing 16.1, 16.2 just due to deformation during a race. Does that mean all the engines, if that was to be the case, are illegal? Not necessarily. I don't know. I mean, F1 Jordan made an interesting point. He was like, look, if your plank is over the limit, then it's an instant disqualification. To allow an engine manufacturer that knowingly built an illegal engine on purpose to compete would make a complete mockery of what is motorsport. I hear that perspective, but also, again, we don't know enough details to say whether this is true. If the FIA's discussion with the teams have indicated it's fine, or with Mercedes, then it's fine. It is what it is. I know Joe Burrow pointed out it, or Joe Burrow's birder pointed out his opinion in the replies. Again, I think there's a big debate on this at the moment, so I'll leave you guys to have your own perspective in the comment section below. I think my conclusion is that Mercedes are in an interesting position whereby they are supplying 4 teams, including themselves. There is a world where the other teams protest and the FIA says, okay, we're going to come up with a new test and we are going to check this during the race. And as a result, Mercedes might be compromised or whatever. Now, if that was Honda, if it was for Aston Martin, it was one team, then all the other 10 teams would be very much on board with this. But Mercedes almost have a level of power here because they're such an important manufacturer for the sport. They're also powering the reigning Constructors' World Champions. So and they also have 3 other teams on their side on this issue, and potentially Red Bull as well, given the rumours that we have. So if the FIA were to say something, if there was one outlier team that was, quote unquote, cheating, then it would be possible to exclude them. But, and I'm not even necessarily talking at this point what is fair. I'm just talking what is realistic, what is plausible. Do you think that the FIA, with the commercial implications in play, would do Indianapolis 2005 and for every Grand Prix of the season, at least for the first few, because it would probably take Mercedes 6 months to come up with an engine that complies if what we think they might be doing is actually real? In which case, the first half of the season, Mercedes will not be competing, and neither with all the other cars. It's just not going to happen. Whatever you think about fairness, that is not going to happen. So that's also one of the other advantages that Mercedes have by being a big team, is that they're on some level, they're like too big to fail in a way. I don't know if you guys agree, or maybe like I'm misguided here, but I think there's some truth to this, that because Mercedes know that they're so important as a manufacturer, they can throw their weight around a bit when it comes to these conversations, because they know that the FIA can't really just ban their engines. Maybe they should, depending on your perspective. I don't think they should, but again, I don't really know. Nobody really knows exactly what is going on here. So anyway, there's your engine update for the day. I mean, it's incredible how much stuff is coming out about this pretty much every single day at this point. Maybe over Christmas we'll have something else to talk about. But very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.